Robert Blair Kaiser will tell us about the concept of the autochthonous church, meaning a homegrown church. He was a correspondent for Time, Newsweek, and the New York Times, and he covered Vatican II and won an Overseas Press Club Award in 1962 for, quote, the best magazine reporting of foreign affairs, unquote, for his coverage of the Council for Time magazine. He is the author of 13 books, including Pope, Council, and World, The Story of Vatican II, published in 1963, The Politics of Sex and Religion, A Case History in the Development of Doctrine, 1962 to 1984, published in 1985, as well as A Church in Search of Itself, Benedict XVI and the Battle for the Future, published in 2006. In 2008, he published Cardinal Mahoney, an action plan for the future of the Church, disguised as a novel. He speaks here about the need for an American Catholic Church in communion with Rome, but also very American.
You say the Catholic Church is crumbling in America.
It's falling apart. The people have lost confidence in the leadership. They don't trust their bishops, partly as a result of the sex abuse crisis, where the bishops have been covering up for their bad priests. And we have no way of knowing what's going on inside the church. Every week we get stories in the press about this Monsignor or that priest that's stolen millions of dollars so they could go off on vacations in the Bahamas. And we're fed up. We have a sense that we don't own the church, and we need to own it. We need to have a voice, a vote, and citizenship in our church, making the Catholic Church still a Catholic Church, but a Catholic Church American style. And how do we get that? Well, we do it American style by having a revolution, as we did at the beginning of this country, where we set up a constitutional convention. We had checks and balances by setting up a legislative branch, a judicial branch, and an executive branch that would check and balance each other. And the people would have a voice and a vote and ownership of their country. We own this country. Well, we don't have a sense of owning the Catholic Church. The Church seems to be owned by the Pope and the bishops. So they continue to exercise this kind of monarchical power from the top down, imposing it on us below. And that's the wrong paradigm, the wrong metaphor for the modern world. We live in a bottom-up kind of world, and we still have a top-down kind of church. Now, people say, well, the church is not a democracy. Well, they don't know their own history. From the very beginning, the church was a democracy. The people that surrounded the early apostles lived in common, and each acted according to their own gifts and their own duties, and they didn't even have bishops. Pope Leo V and Leo the Great in the 5th century said, "He who rules over all must be elected by all." So that prevailed in the church for centuries. Bishops were appointed by their local kings or parliaments or elected by the people until 1829, when Rome decided that, well, the Pope should nominate and elect all the bishops, which obviously made the bishops accountable to the Pope and not to the people who elected them. So that late in the church, 1829, the church had been going on for 18 centuries before it became a totally monarchical kind of church. And that's so alien to the way we think in the United States. We'd like to see a more American Catholic Church. And people will say, well, that's too revolutionary. They don't know their history. They don't realize that we've had autochthonous churches in this Catholic Church of ours. There are 22 of them, mainly started in the Middle East, the Melkites, the Maronites, the Copts, the Byzantines, the Chaldeans, and so forth, who have had their own polity, their own patriarch, their own priests, their own language, their own liturgy in their own language, some married priests, some not married priests, and they're still united with Rome. They are accountable to and in communion with Rome. They're still Catholic in every sense of the word. So my neat idea, I think it's a neat idea, is to go forward, we have to go back. That will ease the mind and the hearts of traditional Catholics who say, well, we can't have anything new in the church. We've got to go back into tradition. What's traditional about a democratic church? Well, we have to show them that autochthonous churches are very traditional. I'm not talking about autonomous churches. I'm talking about autochthonous churches. That means, it's a Greek word, it means from the ground up. Homegrown, homespun, homemade, according to our own culture. I remember in Rome, I was visited there in the Jubilee year by a Catholic couple, Pat Shea and her husband Jack, who had to give a presentation to the Pope on behalf of the Hollywood community. And when all the pomp was over and all the marching and the bands and all that stuff, Pat turned to me at lunch and said, why can't we have a more American church? And I thought, good question, why can't we? It's not an unthinkable idea. In 1925, Cardinal Mercier of Belgium proposed that the Anglican Communion be brought into communion with Rome whole and entire, with the Archbishop of Canterbury serving as the Patriarch of England, and they would have their own Book of Common Prayer, their own English language liturgy, their own married priests, and that they would be totally Catholic. And it was a great idea, but it was an idea way ahead of its time. Pope Pius XI vetoed the idea and, in fact, disciplined Cardinal Mercier and said, I don't want you to have any more of these conferences where you're bringing Protestants together with Catholics. And that remained the policy of the Church for 37 years until the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, when the bishops met and formed a new idea of the Church. They turned the pyramid, the hierarchical pyramid, upside down. Strange thing for bishops to do, but they did it. Under the inspiration, we think, of the Holy Spirit, they turned the pyramid upside down, and they put the people at the top of the pyramid and the Pope and the bishops at the bottom. The duty of the bishops was to serve the people, not to dominate over the people. So they created a charter for a listening church. Unfortunately, that charter was quickly deep-sixed by the Vatican. After the council, all the bishops went home, and the Vatican administration subverted that charter, that intent to create a more of a people's church. And so we don't have it. We've got it in the charter that we should have a people's church, but nobody knows how to get there. My idea is to create an autochthonous church in America. And how do we do that? By having a constitutional convention for the Catholic Church in America. That's not a new idea either. In the 1800s, we had 3 national councils, the First, Second, and Third Council of Baltimore, where the bishops got together and wrote rules for the American church. We could do the same thing. It's even allowed in canon law that various nations can have national councils to set rules for their own way of being. And their canon law even provides for the fact that these national councils need not be peopled only by bishops, but by 50% of the makeup of the Constitutional Convention could be non-bishops. And so we would have a balance here. And we could create something on the model of the U.S. Constitution with a tripartite government, an executive branch, a judicial branch, a legislative branch that would each be accountable to the other and serve as checks and balances, so we wouldn't have this absolute power ruling absolutely. See, that's the problem right now. We look to the Pope as an absolute ruler. He makes all the laws, he executes all the laws, and he interprets all the laws. And so that's tyranny. And that was the kind of tyranny that the founding fathers of this country met when they decided to revolt against England. And they started the revolution against this tyranny. Well, we've got the same kind of tyranny in the Catholic Church, but we can't think outside the box. We think that tyranny was imposed by Jesus Christ. Well, it wasn't. The governance of the church is a very human thing, and it's grown over the years. It's like they often compare the church to the bark of Peter, that is the ship of Peter. Well, I say the bark of Peter has been sitting in a safe port for too long, and it's encrusted over with barnacles. And those barnacles have to be removed, and we have to get back to the original primitive face of the church as it was started by Jesus Christ, where we are people who need to be inspired by the gospel and feed the hungry and clothe the naked and find shelter for the homeless, and that's what it's all about. And we can't do it in this day and age because the Vatican doesn't seem to want to let us do it. We talk about accountability in the church, giving the people a voice, a vote, and ownership. Canon law says we can't do that. Well, bail on canon law. Canon law was not given to the Catholic Church on tablets of stone by Moses or Jesus. It was created in the 13th century according to a Roman model. So we got to just forget about canon law, create our own law in the United States that creates an accountable church. If we have an accountable church, then the bishops and the priests can't get away with rape and murder as they've been doing. They've got to be accountable, and the way to make them accountable is to have an election of bishops. If President Obama appointed all the mayors in America, would the mayors of America be accountable to President Obama, or would they be accountable to the people? Well, they'd be accountable to President Obama. Only by electing mayors by the people of Los Angeles and Detroit and Denver and Des Moines and New York City can we make them accountable to the people. If they're elected, then they can be unelected or impeached or recalled. And so we need this tie, and this is not going against Catholic doctrine. We've always believed in the Articles of the Creed. We love our Mass, we love Jesus, we love the sacraments. All we're talking about is creating a new kind of way of governing ourselves that makes sense in the modern world and doesn't make sense to anybody else.
In your opinion, what is the greatest obstacle to creating an autochthonous church in America, and how can it be overcome?
It's the force of inertia. We've always done it this way. One of the worst things is to say, well, we can't change because we've always done it this way. Well, we haven't always done it this way, so we've got to educate ourselves about the history of the church and how it started out as a democracy and continued as a democracy, even in these autochthonous churches which still exist. In a recent trip to Turkey, I found out that the Armenian church in Turkey elects their patriarch, elected by 60 lay people, men and women. They're not appointed by the Pope, although they're in communion with Rome. They're autonomous, i.e. autochthonous. They're from the ground up and they follow their own culture. So how do we get the American people to start thinking outside the box? Well, by educating ourselves, by having conferences, by having debates, the American way. We gradually come to new ideas, and we create a critical mass of public opinion. And people say, well, how many people does it take to create a critical mass? Well, we've got 70 million Catholics in this country. Will it take 70 million Catholics to create a critical mass? No, that isn't the way it works. In the Philippines, in the 80s, the people of the Philippines wanted to get rid of their dictator, Ferdinand Marcos. They got 500,000 people, and they marched up the Avenue of the Epiphanies, and they demanded that Marcos step down, and the next day he was gone. So it only took like 5% of the population of the Philippines, which was 8 million at the time, to create a critical mass in the Philippines. Back in England in 1215, in Runnymede, it only took a few English lords to force King John to sign the Magna Carta. That's all it took then. A critical mass was a few British lords. I don't know how many it would take in the United States. I do know this, that Americans are attuned to the idea of revolution because that's our history. We were founded in a revolution, and we not only declared ourselves independent of England, but we fought for independence. And I know that fighting is kind of not a good word in the Catholic Church, where after all we're the Church of Jesus, the Church of love, of the Beatitudes, love one another and everything. But we've got to learn to fight civilly and gently in the marketplace of ideas. We're not trying to hang the bishops like the French revolutionaries were executing and taking the bishops to the guillotine. We don't need to do that. We have a much milder kind of culture that we live in, and we believe in the civilization of ideas. Civilization is men and women engaged in intelligent argument, and that's what we need to do. We need to argue intelligently. Is it going to happen? I don't know. We need to talk about it. It's all in the hands of the Holy Spirit. It'll either happen or it won't happen. If the time has come for this idea, then it'll happen. If the time has not come, I'm willing to go along with the Holy Spirit and say, okay, Holy Spirit, I can wait. I have to take care of myself, though, so I live long enough.